In this session, we will explore the lives of a few of the key people, figures, and characters in the Old Testament. The reading you completed focused on an important group of people called the Patriarchs. The Patriarchs are the fathers or early leaders of the Jewish faith. There are technically only 3 patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. However, we will include Joseph because he's an integral part of the Old Testament story as well. Each of these 4 men were related to one another in some way. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac was the father of Jacob, and Jacob was the father of Joseph. As the book of Genesis records the actions of these men, let us not forget they are people who experienced both greatness and failure just like you and I. For example, do you remember how Abraham had enough faith to follow God to a new land, but lacked confidence in God? He lied to Pharaoh about who his wife was. Or do you recall how Jacob was a manipulative person, but sought to humbly restore his relationship with his brother? God worked through the patriarchs just as he can work through us. The stories of the patriarchs make up much of the book of Genesis because they help us understand the history of our faith. The story of the patriarchs is much more than just family history. It is also a record of God's recurring activity in their lives. The accounts of the patriarchs in Genesis shows us how God was constantly active and moving in the lives of his people. The story of the patriarchs begins with Abraham. In Genesis, God begins creating a special people by calling Abraham, then called Abram, to leave his home of Ur and to go to the land of Canaan. If Abraham was faithful to God, God promised several things to him, such as blessing anyone who blessed him and cursing anyone who cursed him. One other promise was to bless Abraham and make him the father of many nations. The only problem was that Abraham and his wife Sarah were childless and about 100 years old. Abraham and Sarah, thinking God must not know what he was talking about, decided to solve the problem by having Abraham conceive a child with Sarah's younger helper, Hagar. This situation shows that you can be a father of faith and still have a hard time trusting God. God does come through for Abraham and Sarah, and they have their own child, who they named Isaac. The story of Abraham helps us introduce the term covenant, which is a very important concept in the Old Testament. God and Abraham made a covenant or special agreement in which they each committed themselves to the other. It's important to understand that a covenant is not a contract, such as some rigid legal document listing obligations. A covenant is a special relational agreement between 2 parties and represents the establishment of a relationship. In Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 21, God begins a special covenant with Abraham. Later we will see God create a covenant with the Israelites. We are privileged to get to experience the greatest covenant of all, the relationship that is available because of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. One of the most powerful stories in the Old Testament is of Abraham's only son, Isaac. How did you feel when you read the story of God calling Abraham to sacrifice his only son, the one God had given him? How would you feel if you were placed in a similar situation and God called you to sacrifice a child or someone you loved? If you recall, God did this to prove Abraham's faithfulness. Abraham passed the test with flying colors when he chose to commit himself to sacrificing his son as God called him to. God stops Abraham at the last moment, knowing the depth of Abraham's faith. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his only son was mirrored in the way God sacrificed his only son to die for our sins. Isaac's 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, had many differences. They were different in appearance, in occupation, in relationships, and in character. Genesis described Jacob as a deceitful and manipulative man who lied to his dying father and tricked Isaac into blessing him. Esau might have been a bit foolish, as seen in the soup incident, but he did not have the moral flaws Jacob did. Jacob helped destroy the relationship between him and his brother, Esau. However, he eventually grew from there, deepening his walk with God, and sought to restore his broken relationship with his brother. By the end of his life, Jacob had 12 children who were the source of the 12 tribes that would come to make up all of Israel. The last person we will talk about is Joseph. He was not technically a patriarch, but he was a very important person in the story of Genesis. Joseph was Jacob's youngest son and was clearly his favorite. Early on, Joseph recognized that God had big plans in store for him. This fact, coupled with his father's favoritism, turned his brothers against him. They seized him and sold him into slavery. Although he was then falsely accused of rape and imprisoned in Egypt, Joseph's story still illustrates how God can work through even the darkest of circumstances. Joseph's imprisonment was an opportunity for God to show his greatness. Over time, God favored Joseph, and he came to be second in command of the empire that once held him in slavery. Eventually, Joseph reunited with his family and brought them into Egypt so that they could escape the famine that gripped Israel. The story of Joseph serves as a transition between the books of Genesis and Exodus and helps explain how the Israelites ended up in Egypt. We could study the patriarchs just to learn about the stories of our faith and to hear of the people and their experiences. These stories are not just about the past, but they also speak to the present. People recorded them and handed them down for generations, centuries, and millenniums to show how God was active in people's lives for the sake of empowering a relationship with Him. When we look at the covenant made with Abraham, the visions given to Jacob, and the path created for Joseph in the darkest of times, we see God acting for us on our behalf. The Old Testament tells the stories of God's activity in our lives. With this in mind, answer the relational questions and use your answers to apply what you have learned to your life.